Good morning. It's good to be back, to see you all on this nice warm day. Grace. What is grace? We have hymns about it, we see it in the scriptures, but what is grace? I've been wrestling with that for a long, long time. And the only way that I can describe grace is what we experience after we have encountered the holy. After we have encountered holiness, grace touches us, fills us. Grace has the power to utterly transform us. And we've seen that many a time. Grace filling us, transforming us, changing the way that we see, changing the way that we hear, changing the way that we treat one another. Grace has that power. But you see, grace is really an invitation. It's an invitation to us for that change. The world doesn't change when we encounter grace. We change. We change. Things that we never seem to notice before, we suddenly begin to notice in a new and more powerful and deeper way. People that we sort of overlooked and never thought much about suddenly touch our hearts and change us. We change. The world stays the same, but we change. Sometimes grace comes, and this is what makes it a little complicated. Sometimes it comes as a little tug on your sleeve. Hey, wake up. Sometimes it comes as a cataclysmic bolt of lightning, as St. Paul found out on his way to Damascus. Boom! There it was. Made blind, deaf, unable to speak. And when he came out of that, grace abounded within him and utterly transformed who he was and who he would become. Grace. It's powerful, and yet it's simple. All it requires of you and me is to open ourselves to its possibility. As I say, I've been thinking a lot about grace lately and been kind of going through my life. When you get to a certain age, you do that. None of you know that yet. But when you get to a certain age, you begin sort of looking and saying, what touched me? What changed me? What made me who I am? And as I look back, I find these points in time when grace literally touched me. Grace points that altered how I thought, who I was, and what I became. I think, for example, of Ethel. Now, Ethel and her sister Beatrice were well into their 90s. This was my first church, and I found out that they lived in a big old house in Providence overlooking Narragansett Bay, and I was told, you got to go visit them. Well, of course I did. So I went to visit Ethel and Beatrice, and I got to their beautiful old house. Their father had been a lawyer, and he had been a judge, and this was a family of some repute in the area. Everyone else had either died or had moved away, and they were left alone in this great big old beautiful house. And I got there probably a little afternoon, and I knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, no answer, and finally I heard the shuffling of feet, and Beatrice came and opened the door a crack. Who is it? And I said, I'm your new pastor. She said, oh. And then she said, well, come in. So I went in, and there she was in her bathrobe and slippers, and she said, let me get Ethel. And so she called upstairs, and Ethel came down, and Ethel, too, looked a little bit askance at me. And as we sat there, we chatted a little bit. I could sense the discomfort, and so finally I said, well, I think I'll move along now. And they said, thank you. And then Ethel said to me as she got up, she said, "Pastor, you need to know that we're not in the habit of entertaining gentlemen callers before 3 o'clock. I visited with Ethel many times. Ethel was an artist. She taught art at the Classical High School. She even taught some at Rhode Island School of Design. She had a marvelous eye for beauty. The next time I went there, I called first. It was 3:30. And we chatted, and Ethel finally took my arm. It was winter. She took my arm and she said, "Pastor, let's go for a walk in the garden." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Yes." So we went outside, we walked down the stairs, and we got into the garden, and she held my arm so tightly. And we walked about 10 steps, and she said, "Look, do you see it?" All I saw was trees that were barren and bare, a gray sky. I didn't see much. And she said, "No, no, no, that branch." She said, look how it leaves the bough and bends down and then comes up and down again and then up. And look, at the end, it's stretching toward heaven. She said, "What a wonderful metaphor for life. We're born, ups, downs, joy, sorrow, and in the end, we look toward the Lord." She said, "Pastor, do you see it?" Yes, I think I do see it. Well, every time I visited with those sisters, Ethel would say to me, "Pastor, let's take a walk." And we would go out in the yard, winter, summer, fall, and she would always find that one thing to stop at and to point out: the color of the flower, the new growth coming out of the ground, the birds singing, the sky, the clouds, the magnificent white clouds, the seagulls over Narragansett Bay. And she would always say, "Pastor, do you see it? Do you see it?" And then she would tell me what she saw. She was trying to teach me how to see the world through her eyes and to find grace in the simple things. What a gift. There are many times that we encounter the holy, that we find grace in our lives. As a pastor, I've been called numerous times to go to visit people on their deathbed. Some of you have had that experience. In fact, just 2 months ago, Janice and I were at the deathbed of her brother as he was slipping into his final death. And you gather around the bed and you hold the hand and you whisper beautiful things into their ears and you say a prayer and you hope that they hear you. And sometimes you know that they do, and you just stay there and you're present with them. The old Celtic monks had a word for that time. They called it the thin place. That thin place between life and what comes after. That thin place that is for those who are in that moment when they are sliding off. And to be invited to that thin place is one of the great gifts of grace, to be present with it. It's a holy time, and we get to share it. Grace. Grace can tug at our sleeves gently and say, "Hey, Pastor, did you see it?" Or it can say, "Hey, wake up." But in any case, what it does for us, it opens our eyes, it opens our ears, and above all, it opens our hearts. How do we respond to grace? For me, there have always been a couple or three ways that I've responded, hopefully. One is with gratitude, just to be alive, to be with the beauty of the earth, to be with the wonder of friends, gratitude. Deep, heartfelt gratitude. Another way that I've seen responses to grace is empathy. We get to see people at their very best, at their very worst. We identify with what we see. We've been in both places. And we get to feel with them, to experience with them, to be present to them, to know them. Empathy is a great gift, isn't it? When we receive it and when we can share it. Finally, I think if we're very fortunate that moment of grace, that moment when we have touched holiness and when we are being in the process of transformation, hopefully we gain wisdom. That's a collection of about 15 sermons. What is wisdom? But at the very least, as we think of wisdom, I think of what I've learned in those moments of grace. It's very simply that I am not the center of the universe. I'm just a part of the universe, and wisdom is finding what is my place. Who am I? Where do I fit? And what can I do? And so, it may be that as I talk about grace, you say, well, that's all nice, Pastor, but, I got work to do. There are things going on in the world that I have to keep up with. And as a matter of fact, a friend of mine said to me just recently, we were talking about this very topic, about spiritual life and grace, and he said to me, I hope that when I retire, I'll have time for some of that stuff. That's the way a lot of us are, isn't it? As human beings, really I always think of us as having three parts. We have a body, and we spend a lot of time on this body, don't we? I mean, we try to keep it healthy, and we try to watch our diet, and we get our exercise, and we get our sleep at night, and we go to the doctor when we need to. We spend a lot of time and energy on this body. And then there's the mind. That great gift of reason and rationality and the ability to think and to know things. The ability to put things together. To create things like science and technology. And how wondrous that is, isn't it? Those are two of the parts of who we are as human beings. But the third part is the spirit. How much time, energy do we spend on the Spirit? Not much. And what difference would it make if we do? I'm going to change gears just a little bit here and make a proclamation. I hope I don't offend you, but I'm just going to say the world's in a hell of a mess. I mean, everything from climate change to pollution to fouling this earth, wars, 1,200 Israelis murdered, 30,000 Palestinians killed. I don't have to go through the list. You know we're in a mess. How did we get in the mess? I'm going to suggest because we've lost the capacity to live in grace. To live in grace. I mean, after all, if we really lived in the gratitude of grace, how in the world would we damage this planet the way we do? Right? Makes no sense. We've known for 100 years what's been going on here. We've known all this time about the pollution, the potential for climate change. We've known all of this, and yet we say, oh no, my 401k is doing really well. Those oil stocks are really helping me. Gratitude. Do we really have a sense of gratitude for the gift of life? For the gift of this planet? What would change in the world if we let gratitude be our response? If we found grace in gratitude together. Empathy. What would happen in this world if we began to empathize with one another instead of what we normally do, which is fracture ourselves, right, into 1,000 pieces, black, white, red, yellow, gay, straight, woman, man, old, young. All these ways that we fracture the human family and think of the other as somehow unworthy or an enemy. What would happen if through grace we gained empathy for one another? Would the world be the same? No, grace isn't just some nice-to-do thing. It's the difference between whether this planet will survive or not, whether our great-grandchildren will have a decent life or not. And wisdom, when will we give up believing that we're the center of everything and that creation surrounds us with its beauty, its power, its wonder, and that in it we can find grace? So grace, all these points in our lives when we've encountered, sometimes very simply, sometimes powerfully, we've encountered grace, and our lives have been changed, and we have become new people. Come on, folks. It's remarkable out there. What do you see? Do you see it? Pastor, can you see it? Do you see that? Do you see them? Do you see these? Do I see them? Or am I so busy that I don't have time? This morning we're going to have a grace point. A point of grace at this table when we will have the opportunity to celebrate communion, when we will have the opportunity to relive moments with Jesus, the disciples, and those who have gone before. This is a grace point. Now, I've probably done, I have no idea how many communion services I've done. More than a couple. But you see, sometimes we go through this, don't we? As, well, yeah, it's communion, and we'll have a little piece of bread and a little bit of wine, and we'll say some prayers, and I'll feel a little better about it, but that's good. How about saying that this is communion? This is the gift of grace. This is the gift of transformation. This is the gift of new life. This is the gift of possibility. Do you see it? That's what it is. If only we will be open to it. Some years ago, I decided that I was going to become a French baker. I was going to learn how to make the perfect baguette. I worked at it. Spoiler alert, it never happened. But I got into baking bread. Now, if you bake bread, it's kind of interesting. But if you bake bread with the Spirit, it's a whole different thing. Any of you bake bread? Got a bread machine? Good, throw it away. So, the thing about baking bread, the first thing is, how simple could it be? It's a little bit of flour, a little bit of water, a little bit of yeast, and some salt. That's it. You put it in a bowl, you mix it up, you got this glop. But then the mystery starts. You begin to knead that little glop with your fingers, and you begin to feel it as it slides between your fingers. And you begin to turn it over and do some more, and then over and do some more, and then over and do some more. And pretty soon, that glop turns into a beautiful dough ball. And if you've done it enough, you know when it's ready. You can feel it. Then you take that beautiful ball of dough and you put it in a bowl, and you cover it, and you wait. Now the mystery begins. You wait an hour, maybe two. You take the top off, and there, this little ball of glop has become a beautiful, air-filled chunk of dough. But then you squish it again. Why? I used to hate to do that part. It looked so good that first time. But you squish it again, and you put it on a sheet, and you make it into a loaf, and then you put the cover back on, your sheet or whatever you're using to cover it, your piece of towel, and you wait. You see, grace requires waiting sometimes. It may not come right away. And you wait, and you wait, and suddenly you take that towel off, and there is this beautiful loaf just sitting there saying to you, I'm ready for the oven. You put it in the oven, and you bake it. Now, I've got an oven with a little window in it. You got one of those? And when I first started baking the bread, I would just sit there for the whole time and watch. It's magic. It's a miracle. This little lump turns into a loaf of bread, and it gets golden brown and beautiful. And the smell. Is there a better smell in the world than fresh baking bread? 4 simple things, and suddenly before us is a loaf of bread. And as we come to this table, we have a loaf of bread. Now, this may just be something out of the supermarket, maybe something out of somebody's oven, but whatever it is, it's a miracle. It's a wonder. And when we take the bread, we break it. And there, inside of that loaf, is all of the miracle that we have just witnessed, the beauty of it, the power of it. You see, it's no accident that in the Scriptures we call the bread of life, because it reminds us the small loaf, the small handful of dough rises. That's a resurrection. And then it sinks. And then it rises again as a resurrection. And then it comes to its full glory. And it feeds us. So this morning, as we take our communion, this isn't just bread. This is the gift of life. And as we drink of the wine, it's not just juice. It is the gift of sacrifice. And so, I ask you, let this be a grace point for you. Let the bread, the wine, the prayers fill you. Let you touch the holiness of this whole simple baking of bread, which will feed our souls and our lives. And so I invite you as we prepare for our miraculous feast of life, to be prepared to engage with the wonder of grace. The bread as it is broken is the gift that feeds our hearts, that makes us whole. The wine reminds us that in this life there are times of sacrifice and hurt. But there are also times of justice, hope, and new life. So as you come forward and receive these elements, may they be for you the bread of life that fills you, the wine of life that enables you to live with justice and the prayers that enable our souls to be lifted. And so may this table be for us a point of grace. Amen.